Summer 2014. I'm on tour with my band. We're playing a festival, Shaky Knees in Atlanta, which practically speaking means I got to wake up extra early and now I'm yawning in line for a porta potty. I've been drinking too much and sleeping too little. My world has shrunk to the size of a 15-passenger van with a busted air conditioner. Yes, I'm living the dream, but today I'm feeling a little sorry for myself. The porta potty opens, and I'm sort of aware that the guy who comes out, plaid, clad, and rumpled, is the singer in another band playing today. But what I don't realize yet is that this is Paul Westerberg, singer-songwriter of The Replacements, a man and a band whose careers make mine look like a nice slow ride on the lazy river. Welcome to Major Label Debut, the podcast about major label debuts. I'm Graham Wright. Today, we're talking about Tim, the major label debut of an unlikely major label act, The Replacements. And I am so excited to be joined by the renowned music journalist Bob Mehr. We're going to talk about his incredible 2016 book, Trouble Boys, the true story of The Replacements. It's one of the most comprehensive rock and roll biographies ever written, and it's just a completely captivating read all the way through. It follows the band from their origins as restless kids in 1970s America and all the way along their turbulent, to put it mildly, career. The Replacements formed in 1979 in Minneapolis by Paul Westerberg, Bob Stinson, his little brother Tommy Stinson, and Chris Mars. For a certain kind of music lover, they are the be-all and end-all of rock music. The most authentic, the most unpredictable, just the most like a rock band. Because as good as the Replacements songs are, and they are some of the best songs ever written, it's the story of the Replacements, the legend of the Replacements, that really resonates. It's one of the irresistible rock archetypes, right? The self-destructive geniuses who just can't get out of their own way. But of course, like all such stories, this one is not as simple as it appears. Here's Bob Mehr. Thank you so much for being here, Bob, and thanks for the book. I was wowed by it on so many levels. It's an incredible accomplishment, but I'm reading The Power Broker right now, another incredible accomplishment, which is also feels like an incredible accomplishment to read. And yours is so, I was just burning through it. I wanted to read it every spare moment I had. And congratulations on making something that's so researched and definitive and thorough and also entertaining.
Well, I appreciate that. Fortunately, I did spend a kind of inordinately long amount of time working on the Replacements book, but nowhere near as long as Robert Caro has spent doing his Lyndon Johnson biography. So, and I don't know how long he spent on The Power Broker, probably as long as I did on that. So I'll take that compliment and to be anywhere in the universe of that is nice.
And it certainly helps that you have as characters not Robert Moses, but Paul Westerberg and Bob and Tommy Stinson and Chris Mars and the rest. They're so captivating as people, and you capture them in such a captivating way that as I was reading it, I found myself singing differently and thinking about music differently and looking to buy Gibsons a lot. And I was drinking more. And this is not a book that glamorizes drinking by any stretch. You worked on this for more than a decade, right?
Yeah, start to finish, really, the first kind of the germ of the idea came around 2006 and kind of took a couple of years to get to the starting gate with the band. And, part of my whole idea or motivation for doing the book was to do a kind of definitive story. And that meant getting the principals involved and knowing they would be. So that was another couple of years kind of. And then I sold the book in 2009. And we were just about done with it. It took about 5 years, really, research and writing. And then, of course, the band decided to reunite in 2013. And so it seemed like it was worth waiting to see how that reunion was going to resolve or go on or whatever was going to happen. So fortunately or unfortunately for the band, but fortunately for the book, they stopped very abruptly in the summer of 15. And, my book came out the following spring. So it was kind of a perfect timing, for publication. So the timeline got a little bit elongated by the fact that they decided to reunite and tour for a couple of 3 years. But yeah, it was definitely a decade sort of in the making. And then, it's been almost another 8 years since, and I've sort of found myself still working on replacement stuff through the catalog stuff we've been doing through Rhino Records and reissuing some of their projects and doing new projects with the Replacements catalog. So at this point, I'm about 18 years in, really
immersing yourself in that story and in that world, did you find your own attitude changing? Did you find your own, drinking habits, guitar shopping habits, etc., being swayed by their gravity?
Well, I mean, certainly doing something like this book, and as long as I sort of lived with it and as deep as I got into the lives of the people involved, there was definitely, and it was my first book and first time really spending years on a really long and big project. So yeah, I mean, it had to affect me in a lot of ways. The drinking sort of didn't really come into effect except for the few times where I was, maybe interviewing one person or another, namely Tommy Stinson, and trying to keep up with him, which is sort of like trying to go, toe to toe with Mike Tyson or something. So no, I mean, mostly I was really kind of had my eyes on the finish line with the book. And first and foremost, as a fan, it was a story I was interested in. And I think that's why I was able to sustain my interest in the research and learning about the story for so long, and why it's kind of continued on is, fundamentally I'm a fan first, and I wanted to know more about the story myself. So that's why I was able to kind of ride with it through the many years and many changes and many upheavals that came along with writing the book and doing these other related projects.
It really seems to me like the fan's dream. That's the kind of fan I've always been too. I want to immediately learn as much as I can and discover as much. I fantasize about doing what it sounds like you did, going into the vaults and listening to the outtakes and listening to the alternate versions and everything.
Sure.
Did you have any idea that it was going to be this big of a project when you started?
No, I mean, there's always as I told my editor, I take a year to research and a year to write. Of course, that proved to be folly. Man announces his plans and God laughs. But the thing for me was that I just followed the story, and in a way, even though the replacements had been written about extensively over the years, and they weren't, while they were a cult band, they certainly weren't an unknown band. So there was plenty of a paper trail and a kind of history and a myth around them. But what I was trying to do was kind of get at something I think a little deeper and a little bit more under the skin in terms of their story and who they were and why. That was really the question. It was a lot of the replacement story up to that point had been a lot of what they did and how they did it, and kind of anecdote based and sort of this mythology. But what I wanted to know really was kind of the why of the story. What was at the root of what made them so powerful, and sort of what kept them from being bigger stars, and what their sort of personal lives were like, and what the sort of in some ways the triumph and the tragedy of the band was about. And so to do that, it was just kind of pulling a thread really, and sort of seeing where the whole thing unraveled over years. And I guess I have a natural inquisitiveness and a kind of doggedness that's in this case served me well, because the book has been pretty well received, and obviously it's kind of been a life's pursuit at this point for half my life. But no, I didn't know at the top it was going to be so involved. But as I came to the story, I pretty quickly realized this was a unique and remarkable story in a lot of ways, and a very human story in a lot of ways. And so I wasn't just writing a book about a band or doing a band biography. It was a book about the human condition and human frailties, and what happens when people sort of find each other in a special way, as these guys did, and how that can sustain you and how that can destroy you too. So yeah, I think the length and the odyssey that it became really had more to do with the story that was there than anything I knew going in.
Yeah, they have such a mythic quality to them. And, I know myself from years of playing in a band, how the stories can get exaggerated or codified into slightly legendary versions of themselves over the years. As a fan, and also as a journalist, did you ever encounter tension in your writing between printing the legend or uncovering the truth behind it? Was pulling back the curtain something that you struggled with while you were writing, or did it just sort of come naturally in the pursuit of the truth?
No, and strangely enough, and all that credit really has to go to the band, because almost any other group would have airs and would have sort of a kind of image of themselves that they would want portrayed or revisit or rewrite history. And, from the outset, one of my first serious conversations with the book about Paul at his home in Minneapolis, he said something that really was kind of the guiding star of the whole process. And that was, he said, if you really want to do this book right, it's not going to be flattering to us. It's not always going to be pleasant or a happy story, but, basically you should tell the truth. And so that was kind of, I took that as my remit from him, and really with the other guys too, and really how they conducted themselves even in their career. They weren't about artifice or imagery. I mean, certainly they had a sense of theater and showbiz and mythology, because, Paul was a great fan of rock mythology and all that stuff. So they understood it, but as people, and I think that's one of the things that makes them so compelling as a band and continues to keep them relevant and fresh and having new audiences connect with them, is there really is something deeply direct in who they are as people and what they are as a band and what their music is. And I think, with a lot of groups, it is an act and it is a performance and they separate themselves. But, the Replacements poured everything of who they were, both good and bad, into their music and into their careers. And I think people kind of just instinctively recognize that. The other thing I think too for them is, and for the readers, is that most rock band bios, at the end of the day, if somebody's writing a book about you, you're probably successful or famous or rich. And there really isn't a lot of jeopardy in, whatever is being written about, because at the end of the day, it's like, oh, yeah, this happened and that happened. But at the end of the day, we're successful rock stars. With the Replacements, it's not quite that story. So there's a lot more sort of humanity in it and a lot more relatable aspects. Like you said, you played in a band. That's probably been kind of the most heartening thing, is so many people who maybe they didn't even get to the major label level, but they were in bands and on indie labels and had that experience, could relate to it. And so I think from that perspective, the Replacements as a band, as an experience, is much more relatable to a wider range of people than, say, the Rolling Stones would be, or even Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, or whatever, pick your big rock and roll band,
Oh my God. Yeah. It was like they were inventing what my career ended up being. I've been in an indie band for 20 years practically. We never quite signed to a major, although I did notice Michael Goldstone made an appearance in the book, and he signed us once to a big indie. So that was and we did we tried to get on the radio, and we went and played the Christmas shows. And the path of least resistance when you're doing that is to tell a million little lies all the time.
Sure.
Like every time you hobnob with some, dick radio guy or whatever, it's just easier to smile and move on. And the Replacements seem like they could not lie. And that both kind of made them not ideal major label candidates, but they must have been in a lot of ways ideal subjects for a biographer.
Yeah, exactly. As I went and interviewed people who had to deal with them during their career in the 80s, there was definitely some lingering frustrations and resentments of people who just thought, oh man, why didn't they do this? Or why didn't they do that? But of course that makes for good fodder. And of course there was more there than them just being obstinate. There was some deep seated issues. And, again, it's this kind of, their whole story is a kind of dichotomy or paradox of, they made this incredible, powerful music. And the same thing that sort of allowed them to do that was maybe the same thing that kept them from becoming big stars or playing the game or whatever it was. And so yeah, it was an easier task for me not having had to live through the actual experience, but just sort of writing about it in hindsight, because as you say, it definitely made for good copy, for a good book, and for a good story, which is the other thing. Again, you always want to try and tell the truth and get to some deeper level when you're writing about a group of people. But it's also, it was a constantly entertaining tale along the way with those guys as well.
It certainly was. And I got to say, as a band guy who has done a lot of, smiling and going along with it, it was cathartic in some ways to read about all these dismayed suits watching in horror as the band just sort of destroyed opportunity after opportunity. And I never did that. And so it was kind of nice to see someone just fully say fuck you to the man, Well,
and it's also funny, though. I've had a kind of a different reaction, too, from a lot of people who were either on major labels or maybe didn't get those opportunities. A lot of people were frustrated, particularly people who'd been in bands or been around at that time trying to make it in the music business. And they were mad that these guys had thrown away so many opportunities, great opportunities that they would have killed for. But again, you can't really separate the sort of self-sabotage or whatever, which, is always been part and parcel of their story from the very beginning, or certainly from the time that they, left the indie labels and went to the major labels. That was kind of their reputation even then. You can't really separate that from the story. It would be a far different tale if they had played the game and even had a little bit of a hit. And I talk about that in the book, other bands who they were friends with who did have a little bit of success or had a kind of fluke hit, and how it sort of changed the perception of them. And I think in a way, I always say the Replacements have stayed pure, and because they weren't successful and didn't have a commercial hit and weren't sort of fixed, forever in a moment in 1986 because they were on MTV or something like that. And I think, the fact that they didn't get the brass ring kind of keeps them more interesting than if they had. He said that to me. I remember probably that same time that I went to his house in Minneapolis the first time, I said, what if this had happened? Or what if you'd done this? Or what if you'd had a hit? And he said, you wouldn't be here. And so, and I think that's sort of true in a way. I think his catalog and their body of work stands on its own, but I think something would be different if things had broken a little differently for them commercially or whatever. And so, I told the story that as it was and as they lived it. And I think it happens to be more interesting than the usual success story.
And you talk about some of the bands in the book who did go on to versions of that success, whether it's Green Day or Goo Goo Dolls or bands of that nature. And
Right.
as much as I'm sure those guys have really nice houses, their role in the cultural firmament versus the replacements as time goes by, the difference is really stark.
Yeah, I mean, Green Day, who I've worked with, I mean, they're so big as a rock band. And, that was the interesting thing. And it's something that maybe it was trimmed a little bit in the final version of the book, although I've written and talked about it elsewhere, is like, you see, because the Replacements were such a band that evolved so dramatically over the course of their, decade together and their 8 albums, that you see their influence in a lot of different ways. And certainly in that period in the mid 90s, right after more or less the band had broken up, just a few years after the band had split, you really start to see their influence in different ways. You see like Green Day taking the sort of smart punk pop songwriting that you hear on the first record of the first Replacements record, Sorry Ma, and sort of making that incredibly successful and commercial kind of, and bringing that out in a successful and commercial way. Or you see like a band like the Goo Goo Dolls, which I think really tapped into Paul's sort of adult contemporary ballad side, and those types of songs explode right at that moment. Or then there's the kind of, more kind of rock and roll sort of streak that Paul certainly had that, Wilco, I think, tapped into. So you saw a lot of different bands, even though none of them really sound like the Replacements as we think of them. They may sound like a sliver of the Replacements or a moment in the Replacements catalog. So I think, their influence is pretty profound. And I think for a long time, that was pretty cold comfort for Paul and for the band.
Sure.
Particularly in the 90s after the band split up and, was seen as largely a kind of failed enterprise at the time. And Paul was pursuing a solo career and Tommy was pursuing, his own band. So, for many years, I don't think they wanted to hear how influential they were, how great they were when, they didn't have the sort of tangible benefits of being successful. But I think that's the story of the Replacements at the time, is the great equalizer. And you see how relevant they are now today, even among younger audiences. I mean, we've seen that just in terms of who's buying and listening to their music and the catalog stuff we've done. I mean, the Replacements are a new band, it's not just for 50 plus or 40 plus or 30 plus. I mean, some of one of the biggest slices of their audience now is people who are just finding out and getting into them in their teens and 20s. And I think they're still cool, in a way that maybe a lot of bands from that era aren't. So I think that's really the testament. I always say they sort of were commercial failures in the short term or whatever. They didn't make it on the charts. They didn't sell a lot of records, but theirs is a kind of success for all time, and it's only revealed itself as the years and decades have gone on. And when you see what that body of work means to people now and how relevant it is, we just, at the end of this last year, we did the Tim box set, and there was a big story in the New York Times, and the graphic was about artists revisiting past work, and it was Taylor Swift, the Beatles, and the Replacements. So in that sense, they've, I think, risen and have found their place as one of the great bands and an important band. But for a long time, that wasn't the case, and that wasn't how they were considered.
Yeah, there's this great scene towards the end of the book where Paul's talking to a therapist and saying, everyone on the radio sounds like me. And the therapist is like, okay, that sounds a little paranoid. And then looks into it, turns on the radio and realizes, oh my God, everyone on the radio sounds a little bit like Paul Westerberg in the Replacements.
Right.
It really speaks to the breadth of his influence. So going towards Tim and signing to the major label, I remember when Tokyo Police Club, my band, was talking to major labels at one point. It was like an agonized existential decision, just whether we would go that route at all, never mind what label we were going to go with. And I was kind of surprised in the book how, for the Replacements, in some ways, it kind of seemed like a given. Like Twin Tone, their label, seemed to see itself as a bit of a farm team. And the Replacements are so anti-bullshit, and major labels are typically fairly bullshit-heavy operations. Do you know if there was much conversation in their camp about that like existential question, or was it just obvious for them to do it?
No, I mean, I think you have to think of the context of that time. When they signed in '84, alternative music, at least as a commercial conceit, hadn't really broken. So there was only one path to any kind of real success at that time, and that was through the major labels. I mean, even the generation before them, all the sort of first and second wave punk bands had signed to major labels or major label subsidiaries, if it was in the case of Sire or things like that. So it wasn't like there was any other way to sort of make it in the music business. That was just sort of taken for granted. So there was that part of it where, there was no other path. I think a few years later, there would be, as indie labels grew and as alternative radio as a format grew, there was ways to make it, kind of maybe at least on a different level, or go a different way about doing it. But at that point, it was still just that sort of that major label model. And the other thing is too, there was a real sense of desperation with those guys. I mean, they were all basically unemployable fundamentally. None of them graduated high school. None of them even drove a car. And so music was everything to them. I mean, they wasn't like, okay, if this band doesn't work out, we break up, we go get our degrees in college and go work a job. I mean, there was a real sense of that. And I think that's what drove them. So there was that part of it. I think the other part of it was the way they got signed. They were being courted by a guy named Michael Hill, who went to work for Warner Brothers, but the band had previously known him as a rock writer and show promoter in New York. He had actually been the one that first booked them in Folk City in April of '83 to play on a show. And Michael was a mover and shaker and a good guy and very not your typical major label A&R guy. He came from the indie world and Warner Brothers, which was, certainly the most, the coolest, the most progressive and sort of thoughtful of the major labels at the time, historically speaking, in their A&R history going back to Lenny Waronker and Mo Austin. They had a tradition of, being not the kind of your leather pants wearing A&R guys. They were sort of more thoughtful music fans. And so Michael was coming out of that world and coming out of the indie world and knew the band sort of even before he worked for a major label. Now, he wasn't actually successful in signing them. He tried for a year and a half to sign them once he got the job, and it was looking sort of not very good. And then Seymour Stein, who was the head of Sire, which was a Warner Brothers subsidiary, kind of came in and swooped in and signed them once he saw them and fell in love and brought Michael aboard as an A&R man because Sire didn't really have an in-house A&R team. So he used the Warner's folks. And so it was the kind of perfect A&R situation. You get a guy like Michael who they know and is one of them really. And Paul says that in the book, we considered Michael one of us. And then Seymour comes in, this larger than life character, which also appealed to Westerberg. And Seymour just had an, incredible track record. He signed the Ramones, Pretenders, Dead Boys, all that stuff. So it was kind of a unique situation. And I think and while there were many other labels that were interested in them, principally Columbia was the other one, which was much more of a typical kind of 80s, rock and roll label and the people that worked there. It really was fate and good fortune that they had the right people to sign them. So there was maybe less consternation about it than if it had been, your kind of typical, stereotypical A&R situation. In this case, it was a very unique one with Michael Hill and Seymour Stein. So they were comfortable. And I think there was less, gnashing of teeth and less worrying about any of that other stuff beyond the fact that really that was their only option to kind of keep the band going and to try and do something possibly, because there was no real other viable path, I think, for them.
I've witnessed around me the change that can come over songwriters and bands and artists when they walk into that major label room, and whether it's really comfortable or really uncomfortable or really, hands-on or hands-off or whatever, there's a bigger budget and the stakes can change. And I don't think it's much of a spoiler to say the Replacements didn't suddenly become extremely serious when they signed that deal and started making Tim.
Well, I think, again, because they kind of came into the situation with this reputation of being hard to handle and rambunctious and rebellious and all that stuff. And because Michael, I think, was such a great A&R guy, maybe the only person who could handle them and handle them so deftly, I think they didn't do the things, certainly on their major label debut, that you would maybe with some bands, is bring them to New York or to LA and put them with a big name hit-making producer and have a big budget. Everything they did was sort of the label did was with the fact that, hey, this is the Replacements in mind. So let's have them record at home. Let's have them work with a low-key guy in Tommy Erdely, Tommy Ramone, who they would respect because of his reputation with the Ramones. Let's have them work with their engineer that they've done all their previous albums with in Minneapolis. You know what I mean? There was already, because of, like I say, because of their reputation, there was already a built-in sort of approach, which was kind of the way Warner Brothers approached them for a lot of years, although things grew and changed over time and how they made their records. I think for the first one, there was a real awareness of, let's not rattle these guys. Let's not put them in a position where they might be uncomfortable and react badly. Let's keep them at home, keep it safe, keep it simple, low stakes, because they're going to react better than if, we make the stakes very high. And, historically, anytime the stakes were very high, whether it was like a showcase or somebody, big coming to see the band, you could almost guarantee they were going to sort of throw a wrench in the works. And so I think Sire and Michael Hill were very smart to kind of make that make the first album a pretty low stakes and easy proposition for the band to make, so they wouldn't have to deal with any of the real rebellion, which did come later on later albums for sure.
Yes. And I mean, this is back when major labels would develop bands, and the Replacements never got dropped despite their, rebellious behavior, shall we say, towards the major label, which I don't think you as a guitar band would be getting away with that anymore.
No, and Warner Brothers in particular was like famous for that. I mean, you think of all the albums they let Van Dyke Parks or Ry Cooder make, in the 70s without any, tangible success. I mean, so that was, again, like I said, they were very fortunate to be with the right label where instant results, because even then, certainly now there's no kind of development or, riding with an artist for 3, 4, 5 albums. From the outset, it was like, hey, let them make this first album. It won't be, nobody was really expecting hits or instant gratification. So there was always that built in. Now, I will say that actually changed over time a little bit as the stakes kind of grew and the patience became less as the world sort of shifted during the time in that sort of latter half of the 80s that Replacements on the label heading into the 90s. But no, I mean, on the first one, there's never no pressure, but there was very little pressure for them to kind of succeed or as Paul would say, if you don't make it on this record, it's back to the brooms.
And yet Paul is developing as a songwriter in a way that does seem really almost at odds with his, unprofessional presentation, I'll say. A lot of the great songwriters I know work the way it seems like he worked, that you can really hear on some of the alternate takes and the earlier versions from the reissues, is he's iterating on these songs, I guess, over and over again. And that's what I know a lot of great writers do. The other thing I know a lot of those writers do is be extremely ambitious and driven. And I'm really curious if you think there is more of that in Paul than maybe meets the eye.
Oh, yeah. I mean, he's a very interesting, just purely from a writer's perspective. I mean, he really was a guitar player. Before the Replacements, he was a kind of lead guitar player, hotshot lead guitarist in various bands that he played. And the songwriting came to him late. And I think the idea that he could do it, even though when he was very young, he had written some songs and messed around. But really, for most of his sort of teenage years, he was a guitar player. And I think it was the punk rock and seeing, the whole idea of punk rock, that like you can do it yourself kind of mentality. And I think also when he dropped out of high school, I think he began to educate himself about show business, about, music, about writing, and sort of that also gave him strength. And once he started writing, which really began, I mean, when he came into the Replacements, he had a handful of songs, a couple songs really. It was meeting those guys, the other three, the Stinson brothers and Chris Mars, that sort of propelled him, and then cooking up with Peter Jesperson. So within the first year, he'd written 30, 40, 50 songs, really great songs. And I think his development continued. As you see, I mean, the second record, Stink, was almost was a hardcore record or a pastiche of hardcore. And then Hootenanny is really the sort of departure point, I think, where they decide we can do anything musically, genre-wise. And Paul really starts to find his voice. You really start to see the important songs, something like Color Me Impressed, come out. And then, of course, you get to Let It Be, and that's another breakthrough. And I think what happened with Paul is, as they got on the road, and the band didn't really tour for the first couple of 3 years because Tommy Stinson was still in grade school and junior high and high school. When he dropped out of the 10th grade and they started going out on the road really in the spring of 83, and then really started touring extensively 83, 84 and into the early 85, his world opened up, and the influences and the stimuli became more, just being on the road and meeting people and meeting girls and experiencing things. So I think if you look at starting really with Let It Be, the first few records are really about their world, about Paul's world, about the things he knew, about writing about the band, writing about kind of young experiences and Minneapolis. And as they went out into the world, he started to see those things and write about those things. And of course, musically, they got better. And I think they got tired very quickly of playing loud and fast and rock and, punk rock and hardcore. And so they shifted into trying all these genres. And by the time you get to Let It Be, they're starting to really have their own sound in a little more defined way. And I think Tim is the extension of that. And so in a funny way, he was writing sharper, writing better, with grander, bigger tableaus. But he was writing less songs because they were on the road more. In the old days, he didn't really work and the band wasn't touring. So all he would do was write, or the band would rehearse. And I think, so that had an impact too. But I think the stuff so there's less, for example, there was less outtake material or alternate songs on Let It Be and Tim than probably any of their other records, certainly the ones that came before. But the songs are, I think a little more refined and a little more ambitious, as you say. Even though Paul always left, particularly with his lyrics, always left a room for improvisation and happy accidents and sort of things that would just happen in the recording studio one time. I mean, there's really no set of Paul lyrics that are the same. I mean, he sings them different at every show, just about. But certainly with Tim, I think And again, he was aware that this was an opportunity to be on a label, and they knew they were going to get hurt. So I think there was a lot more. He put a lot more of himself into those songs and effort into those songs than had been in the past, in a way.
It seems like there was some time for the songs to gestate. Like they did those demos with Alex Chilton, and they did a few sessions before the sort of final album sessions got done. And you hear the songs get better and better each time. And do you think, in the world where this record came out on Twin Tone as well, do you think it sounds just like the Alex Chilton demos?
Yeah, that's hard to say. I mean, certainly, they did the Chilton demos. They did a 2-song demo in April that year with Tommy Ramone, and then they started the album in June. It's funny, though, they still toured at the beginning of it. They were still touring at the beginning of 85, kind of the continuing the Let It Be tour. So they were still on the road quite a bit. And so even though there's a few songs that evolve in between the first couple demo sessions, they make the record, a lot of the songs on Tim were things that he wrote sort of just in the lead up to the record, or they weren't even completed songs. And unusually for the band, which is another big part of the story, is Bob Stinson's involvement or lack of involvement in the tracking sessions and his sort of estrangement from the group. This record was probably in some ways less tested out, less worked on, less arranged, less developed than some of their other ones. I mean, if you go back to like the previous record, Let It Be, they were playing some of those songs for a full year on the road before they went into the studio. So I think those songs had more time to gestate. Now there were, as I said, there were a few things that did get sort of worked on early and were demoed a couple times before he got to the main album sessions. But probably half the record were stuff that he was showing the other guys in the studio or right before they went in to make it. So it's a weird mix of things on Tim in particular, in terms of stuff that had been recorded and worked on and probably thought about, and some things that were just, first takes, first time, maybe even the band really hearing them.
One of the big what ifs with Tim is what if Can't Hardly Wait had made it onto that record? Because they recorded it, and some of the versions they recorded are included in the Big Tim reissue, which you worked on and which we will talk about. But none of those versions start with the line, "I'll write you a letter tomorrow," which to me is an all-time great opening line, and like in a way that elevates the song to a level that could have been the hit from Tim or whatever, and yet it just wasn't its time.
Yeah, and that was a song they chased for many years. I mean, they did that in the Chilton demo sessions. They did it during the Tim sessions. They had done it, live for a year. And of course, it didn't even come out for another couple of years officially until the Pleased to Meet Me record. And so, Paul had a tendency, if something wasn't clicking, he's really kind of, he comes from this, almost from a kind of like a bluesman's background, because that was the first stuff and the first music he really played. I think he's very much in the spirit of the moment. He doesn't like to labor over things. He gets bored easily. And so if a song wasn't clicking, or he wasn't somehow satisfied with the arrangement, and like I say, he tried it a bunch of different ways, acoustic, electric, with the cello, as we have on this new version on Tim, that got left set aside. I think that song, even he knew, was something special, and so they did unusually come back to that, where they might have other material that had the sort of same difficulties getting into shape, would have been left in the dust. But I think he knew, in some ways, he always says he's his worst judge of his best material, and I think that's true of a lot of singer-songwriters, but, when he had a real, classic like that on his hands, I think he knew, and I think that's why they did ultimately come back to it and release it. But as you say, songs have their time and their moment, and in that case, maybe it wasn't quite time for that yet. Although, a lot of people always argue if that had been on the record, or if something like Nowhere Is My Home, which had been done during the Chilton sessions, had been on there instead of a couple other songs, would it have been a better record? Maybe, but, I think a lot of great rock records have those kind of what ifs. What if you'd put this on or taken this off or whatever? But I think, that record rolled out the way it was supposed to for a lot of reasons that had to do with what was going on in the band, and not just what was going on musically. Yeah, exactly. And the replacements, they really feel like proof positive of my pet theory that, like, you can't optimize this stuff. It would have been a better record. It would have been the perfect record if only those two songs had been swapped out. But it's like, then it wouldn't have been the Replacements Tim. That's what it is. That's why we're here talking about it. Right. And it's funny, as we've done these reissue projects, I look back at it, there's certain kind of songs that's almost slot into Replacements records in certain spots of, when you look at, like, there's the album run from Tim to Pleased to Meet Me to even to Don't Tell a Soul. They always have a kind of dumb rocker somewhere in the middle of the second side. It was Lay Down Clown, or I'm blanking on what it was with Pleased to Meet Me, or I Won't on Don't Tell a Soul, or Shooting Dirty Pool. Like, it's in that slot. So some of that, I think, was, they were a band that had different sides to them. It wasn't just these great, finely written songs by Paul, or the genre exercises, or beautiful ballads. Sometimes they just want to rock out and throw a kind of purposefully dumb or like roots rock or rock kind of song on there. So I think just having done this stuff, that was part of who they were. And so I think Paul was pretty good about keeping a variety on their records and representing all sides and facets of the band. Again, because as a person and as a band, I think they got pretty bored easily with doing the same thing over and over, or doing one type of thing over and over. And so I think that's why their records have, sometimes have songs that maybe are considered lesser songs or whatever, but they sort of, they're representative of the kind of bigger picture of who this band was.
Absolutely. And, there's a beautiful, rich tradition of bands having rockers on the album, because if you're playing gigs, you need a rocker.
Right.
It's useful to have in your pocket.
It's a functional thing. So, yeah.
Yeah, they're working musicians, and then that's how it goes. So the record comes out, and it is the Replacements' Tim, but at the time, it didn't set the world on fire, I guess it's fair to say.
It was very well received critically, and I think more so, I think the reaction was such that it actually kind of emboldened Warner Brothers. I don't think Warner Brothers knew they weren't sure how well the band would make that transition from the indie world and that kind of underground acclaim to major label world, but they were very well regarded by all the, and they became kind of that proverbial rock critics band. So yes, it's a weird thing. They weren't successful, on a purely commercial level, but I think there was enough stuff in the response and the right people being excited about that record and that band that it was a kind of, weirdly a success, or at least in the label's eyes, who, as I said, they didn't really have any expectations for it.
Over the years, as the album's reputation grew deservedly, there was this parallel rap that it sounded bad and that it was Tommy Ramone's fault. And as you talk about in the book, and then expand on further in the amazing liner notes, the Let It Bleed edition, that was not really fair to Tommy Ramone. Could you talk a bit about what happened with all that?
Yeah, it's still a little murky. And obviously I talked to Tommy many times for the book, and having been involved, intimately in the process of producing this reissue, even then we still don't know exactly what happened. Basically Tommy was hired because he was sort of family with Sire. He was somebody the label could trust, and he was somebody the band would respect, given his, pedigree and background. He was also very, you think of the Ramones as kind of, Joey and Johnny and these kind of big characters of personality, but Tommy was a sort of behind the scenes guy and was much more down to earth. And I think, and had worked with, having worked with the Ramones and other bands, he knew how to relate to sort of difficult rock and roll bands. Certainly you think the Replacements are difficult. It's nothing like the Ramones. So, yeah. He was seen as a guy who could work with difficult artists. He was safe from the Sire perspective, and he was somebody that the Replacements would accept, and getting them to accept a producer would be problematic. But this was an easy thing. But I think Tommy had worked primarily on those Ramones records with Ed Stasium, who was an engineer who ended up remixing Tim Forrest this last year. And Ed was really more of the technical guy. Tommy certainly had his own technical ideas and things, but Ed was kind of his hands and the technical guy in the studio. And the idea, to a certain extent, originally would have been Tommy Ramone producing, Ed Stasium engineering. But because of the Replacements kind of, of the label wanting to keep the Replacements sort of safe and feeling comfortable, they worked in Minneapolis with Steve Felstead, who was their longtime engineer, who had done pretty much all their albums, who was also a great engineer, but Tommy didn't know him. And so his input on the mix in particular was less than it would have been. The best I can put it this way is, this was an opportunity for Tommy Ramone to sort of play a little bit, and I think freed of the sort of creative strictures of the Ramones, which was very locked in, stylistically, aesthetically, to what they were doing. I think he saw the Replacements as a band that he could sort of do some different things with. And I don't know if all that worked. I think the record has kind of a funny sound. Some of it was just being of the era of digital reverb and certain drum sounds. And I think it was also because the band had less input, probably not coincidentally. Tim and the other record we remixed, Don't Tell a Soul, are the two records where the band had the least input in the mix, and not coincidentally, they were probably the most dissatisfied with those records. I always say Tommy Ramone produced a great record, Steve Felstead engineered a great record, but somewhere along the way in the mix, it sort of got away from, I think, Tommy a little bit, and from what the band thought they sounded like and what they did sound like. A lot of people sort of speculated he was trying to make a more commercial sounding record, which may have been true. I think he was just trying to do something that he heard and bring his sensibility to the project. In the end, I don't think it made a huge difference in the commercial fate of that record. I don't think the Replacements were going to, be on the radio in 1985 regardless.
It got a really shitty master too for CD, right? like when CDs came along, they did like a perfunctory master on early digital equipment or whatever?
Yeah. There's a kind of whole history with that. I mean, yeah, once it got in '87, once things started getting sort of done, they did a very bad, not even bad. It was just sort of by rote. They did it for CD, but it was doing this. So it exacerbated the problems, with the record, which was kind of a lack of a bottom end and the drum sounding a certain way. And then with this new box set, we've also done, I think, what is the best remaster, the closest to actually how it should have sounded, and how the original vinyl sounded, which actually sounded pretty good. But the CDs versions, which was what was out there really for most of the last 20 years, only kind of made a bad problem worse in terms of the sound of the record.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's one of those things that I think, for me, it's always about the artist's intentions. Same as when we did the remix of Don't Tell a Soul and gave that project back to the album's original producer, Matt Wallace, because he never got a chance to do the mix. It got handed off to a kind of radio mixer guy who made a record for radio in 1989, not a record that sounded like the Replacements or that was a record for all times. And I think, so that's really what we were trying to do, is to get it back to what the band sounded like, to sort of feel the power of the band, particularly the rhythm section, and to kind of find the songs that were lurking in those mixes that you can still make out. I mean, it's certainly, Tim, as it was released and as it's been sort of loved over the years, is not a bad record. Those songs are so strong, those performances fundamentally are so good that you know it's there and you could feel it and people love it. But I think there was a technical or sonic thing that was sort of holding that record back, that we feel that Ed Stasium, who was, really the person who should have been on that record in the first place and mixing it, was able to bring out. And so it's kind of the best of all possible worlds, to go back 30 some, nearly 40 years later and kind of do what the band really wanted done in the first place,
Oh yeah. And I mean, I was a little taken aback when I first saw that the first disc of the reissue was the new Ed Stasium mix.
Right.
But you listen to it and it's so revelatory. I mean, it really feels definitive.
Yeah. And dimensionally, it's just a whole different record. There's, the one element we haven't talked about is, Bob Stinson was not really present for the tracking of this record. He came in and basically did all his parts and his solos, which is, he's really only on about half of the record at the end of the day. He did that after the fact. So this is the first time the band was working as a 3-piece, doing the basic tracking. And I think him not being there in the main tracking and then sort of coming in later, I think that really altered how the album sounded in a way, but also how Tommy perceived how the mix should go. And what he did in terms of editing out parts, is basically like, as having made records, if you're hearing a record a certain way, and then a guy comes in and, lays down all his solos, I think the tendency is to not, it seems when you're used to something, it seems, kind of maybe too much of Bob. And so I think he dialed Bob back quite a bit on certain tracks. And I think Ed, coming at it with a really fresh perspective and no sort of, feelings about it and just wanting to make a good record, went in and some of Bob's tracks and actually found bits that hadn't been used and sort of put those back in. And some of it's obvious on things like Little Mascara, but it's there on every song, even if it's just little fills or little parts. And it changes the dynamic, I think, in the whole complexion of the record in a way. In addition to, I think, the way that Ed has sort of done the stereo separation it's a much wider record now. Before, it was very much a mono sounding record with everything kind of in the middle. And, so in addition to kind of stripping back the somewhat dated reverb, he sort of made the record dimensionally different. And I think you hear a lot more and you feel a lot more of the band and Paul's voice, rather than it being sort of caged in this reverb. You're really hearing him and, his breaths and his, the emotion, I think, fundamentally. And so that was really kind of the remit and the idea of going back to that session and to those tapes was, let's find the record and get that out rather than the sort of effects or the post-production stuff.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about Bob specifically because, as you mentioned, he's, as well as doing a bunch of cool leads, he's responsible for a lot of those little moments that to me are kind of, that's what the Replacements guitar section sounds like. It is like a collection of just cool little moments.
Right.
And obviously the lead up to Tim and making Tim is when Bob started to really drift away from the band. Well, you were going through the alternate versions and the outtakes in the lead up, to making the reissue. Could you hear his increased absence in like the way that the music was coming together?
Well, you can almost hear it in the demos, in the progression of demos. So like in the Chilton session, he's really on fire. I mean, something like Nowhere Is My Home, the band's cutting basically live and Paul singing live on all those tracks. And there's a real power and they're still together at that point. I think by the time you get to the first demos with Tommy Ramone, they're still working as a 4-piece, but you could tell also Bob is starting to develop maybe a little distance with some of the material that Paul was bringing in. So I think it was a gradual thing. It's like January, they're still firing on all cylinders, fresh on the road, cutting these tracks with Alex Chilton. And it's some of the best playing and some of the best, kind of guitar dynamics between Paul and Bob that you can imagine. You start to hear it go a little bit, start to go away or break up a little bit with the first Tommy and Ramone demos. And then by the time they get to the album, Bob's just not there. He continued working his cook's job rather than sort of be at the sessions. And again, that was more a kind of, passive aggressive sort of thing, I think, on his part, with his decreased role, I think, in the band or in the sort of big picture of the band. It was he had his own issues that were sort of cropping up, that went back to childhood, that really started to display themselves in terms of, mental stuff and addiction issues. And so, that's when I say that the record is, a record isn't made in a vacuum. It's a product of what the people are living in their lives and their experiences. And so this record really is a product of Bob kind of going away. So so what happened, I think, is, Bob came in and did almost like he was a special guest star on the record, really.
Yeah.
He came in and laid all his solos down in a day or two and was responding to what he heard. And in many cases, it was stuff he hadn't heard. And he's not on some of those songs. So there's like half the stuff that's with Bob is this kind of, almost guest star guitar. And then you've got the other half of the record, which is Paul sort of going back to his, lead guitar skills and sort of having to carry all the guitar stuff, both rhythm and lead. And some of it's not quite, he's not going over the top either. I think, on the next record, when they knew going in that it was just going to be a 3-piece record, Pleased to Meet Me, because they cut that after they fired Bob and before they hired Slim Dunlap, that's Paul on everything, on all the guitars, leads and rhythm.
Right.
So I think going in, that one was much more of a guitar record. So this one was like, I always say this was, at this point, the Replacements were a 4-piece where it was 3 guys waiting for the 4th guy to show up. Whereas by the time they got to Pleased to Meet Me, they knew making that record were a trio. And so, and that affects everything. It affects how how everyone's playing off each other, the sort of holes you leave in the song, how the things are arranged, and ultimately the way the producer or the guy who's going to mix it is perceiving things too. So I think, Bob's presence and his absence have a huge impact on the way this record unfolded and what it sounded like, and also what it sounds like now in Stasium's new remix.
Yeah, it's really interesting about Paul going back to lead. It kind of reminds me of Jeff Tweedy going back to lead on Ghost is Born after Jay Bennett left the band, and how that the whole vibe of Ghost is Born and the playing on that record feels so different than the Yankee. Right. I know there's a million reasons for that, and this isn't a Wilco podcast, sadly. But I was going to ask how you heard the other guys, and particularly Tommy, who obviously is Bob's younger brother and also ascended to kind of right-hand man status around this time. If you can hear his playing and his creative contributions changing or getting more bold perhaps when Bob's not in the room.
Yeah, and this is the first album where Tommy actually started writing songs, and there's a song called Having Fun on the box set that is actually a song written by Tommy, but it's sung by Westerberg. Didn't make the record, but it was, that was a big development. So I think, a record is like a pie. If there's 4 people, you each get 4 slices. If one person's missing, you get a bigger piece. And I think that was especially true probably with Pleased to Meet Me. And I think that album's producer, Jim Dickinson, sort of encouraged Tommy more, and he wrote even and did more. But I think on this record, you're starting to see that. And I think what you hear now in this new version in particular is a really incredible dynamic between Chris Mars and Tommy Stinson. They are the core of the record, apart from Paul. And so I think with the new mix, you can really hear that. And I think that was really one of the things that was a big issue or a big, reason for remixing it, was so you could hear Tommy and Chris kind of step into the void a little bit that Bob's absence, had left behind in the tracking. And I think there's a lot going on rhythmically on this record.
Oh my God. Yeah.
That you hear more in the remix now. And I think, again, as a 3-piece band, basically, which is how they cut this record and how they cut Pleased to Meet Me, the Replacements are pretty remarkable. They really were like a real little power trio once you get Paul and Tommy and Chris sort of clicking as one. And I think this is the first time. It was kind of the test run for that, which is what they followed up with on Pleased to Meet Me. But, that was one of the things we were just blown away by hearing Ed's mixes, is hearing Tommy and Chris, and it sounds like they do on Pleased to Meet Me. There's that force and power of that rhythm section. And it's like, oh, that was already happening in 1985 on Tim. You just can't hear it or feel it as much in the original mix.
Even more than the Bob stuff, what jumped out to me listening to the remix was this rhythm section is amazing.
Yeah.
And it's so powerful. And actually, I was really noticing that I found, a hissy old tape bootleg of the infamous CBGB show, which perhaps I should ask you to contextualize that briefly for our listeners.
Yeah, so December, so Let It Be had come out that fall of '84. The band was touring. R.J. Smith had written a cover story, had traveled with them for a while that fall and wrote a cover story on the band for the Village Voice, which at the time was, one of the biggest publications in the country. And they came to New York that the same week. The story was on newsstands, and it was their sort of crowning moment. They had been being courted by various labels, and so they had 2 shows scheduled that week at Irving Plaza show. But they scheduled an earlier secret show on a Sunday night at CBGB's under the name Gary and the Boners, which turned it out to be kind of the real label showcase. There was probably half a dozen labels out there looking to, check them out and sign them and whatever. And of course, they laid an incredible stinker and just really kind of threw the show in the most grand and dramatic way possible, and drove off all the A&R guys. And then a few nights later, they played at Irving Plaza, and fortunately Seymour Stein was there, saw them, fell in love, signed them. So that was the context of the CBGB show, was this kind of unmitigated and maybe on some level sort of intentional disaster to sort of test their potential label suitors.
And you lead the book with the tale of the CBGB show. That's like one of a dozen replacement stories that could have led the book, I sense. It really, it contains so much of their legend. But for me, as a younger guy, I wasn't there the first time around. And so I heard the Replacements' legend even before I heard them as musicians. And I'd always perceived them as like fucking up, Right. And listening to that bootleg of the CBGB show, it's not a show that a major label A&R guy would leave high on. But even when they're fucking around, they're kind of tight. Like, It's kind of clear that they're playing together. And that was maybe the biggest revelation from your book to me, was these guys weren't constantly fucking up. They were constantly throwing it away. They were so in control. It's all on purpose. And I thought they deserve so much credit for that, I think.
Well, yeah, there's a funny anecdote later in the book when the band was on tour with Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers in the summer of '89. And they had this kind of ongoing battle with Petty's road crew, who were professionals and kind of used to, seeing bands go out there and put their best foot forward. And, I think the Petty crew started to think they were just clowns and couldn't play. And then Paul, would just, every once in a while, he would just sort of wink at the other guys, and they would just go into this overdrive and just like be the greatest rock band in the world for 5 or 10 minutes. And, the Petty crew guys were just, they didn't understand it. There's like, well, you could be great if you wanted to. Why don't you want to be? And, that's really kind of the question that the book spends 500 pages trying to explore. But, they certainly were, the legend of them being bad all the time, or even 50% of the time. It's not true. I mean, they were bad famously a few times. And, sometimes you could have the best show and the worst show in the same show. So there were never any one thing, I think. And so, yeah, that part of their reputation is probably the thing that's most overblown. I mean, certainly for the first 4 or 5 years, really, in Minneapolis, they couldn't have gone on and been bad and screwing around on stage all the time. Nobody would have come back to see them or cared about them. For the first 4 or 5 years, first 4 years of their existence, I mean, they were really a great band, 90% of the time, probably. And as things went on, maybe there would be some odd shows. And like I say, they were prone to boredom easily, but yeah, they were always capable. I mean, they were a magical unit in terms of how they played off each other and with each other and how locked in they could be, and mostly were. And
even to say, that it's like, oh, they were blowing these opportunities feels a bit like major label mindset, in terms of like, well, they were blowing, the opportunity to be the most financially successful in that moment, perhaps. But in a lot of ways, they were constantly like doing the wrong thing at the right time to build the legend that they built, that's now carrying them on to be, depicted next to the Beatles and Taylor Swift in New York Times articles.
Yeah. Well, I think that was Paul's innate, some of it was learned. Like I said, he read a lot about, in that interim after he had quit high school before he met the Replacements guys, he was reading a lot about show business, and Barnum in particular. And I think he understood about leaving the audience with something. And, there's stuff that Paul did in the course of a show 30, 40 years ago that is now legendary, or that people who saw that show have always remembered. So I think, he had an innate understanding that he said it in the book, actually, even in the first few months of the band, the first year of the band, his intention was not for somebody to come away from seeing the Replacements, playing some Wednesday night opening slot and saying, oh, did you hear the Replacements? His thing was, he wanted them to say, oh, did you see the Replacements? Almost like remembering some grand or weird or odd thing they did, musically or otherwise. And I think that was always a part and parcel of what they did, and why they sort of transcended most bands who went out and played the same great show every night. It's almost better to be different and weird and maybe bad on some occasions, to sort of fail grandly than to succeed consistently. And I think that was his mentality. He was always about mistakes, I think, and he said it in that famous spin cover story. He's like, rock and roll is about mistakes and making mistakes work for you. I think he understood that. And that's kind of was a big part of who they were all those years and what made them memorable and continues to.
I mean, to go out every night and be sort of slick and professional, it just seems it's the antithesis of everything they represented. It seems like it would have been impossible for them to even contemplate.
Yeah, they couldn't have done it. They were just constitutionally unable to do that. And that was the reality I think they were faced with on that, as I mentioned, on that Petty tour, who are obviously a great, iconic, wonderful rock and roll band. But, they went out in that summer and they were at Petty was at his commercial peak and they were putting on a professional show, playing every night. And they're great musicians and they can sort of make anything compelling. But I think Paul realized that you needed a level of repetition and sort of perfectionism every night to succeed at that level. And I think when they got on that tour or when they got off that tour, they realized that, Paul realized that wasn't ever who they were going to be. And I think, that was basically when the band broke up. They ended up kind of keeping it going for another record and another cycle. But I think that was a real wake-up call to them being on that tour and seeing what you had to do to make it at the highest level of rock and roll. And Paul realized, I can't do that. And pretty much wanted to quit the band right after. But like I say, they ended up making All Shook Down and went on for another year and a half. But yes, I think you're right in that sense that doing that, it just wasn't in the cards for them.
Well, I mentioned you worked on the Let It Bleed reissue of Tim. You worked on the Dead Man's Pop reissue of Don't Tell a Soul. You've been working in sort of is it fair to say, a curatorial role with the band since the book came out?
Yeah, I mean, basically, when I was working on the book, I kind of acquired this level of knowledge about the band and had gone through the archives, both the Twin Tone archives and the Warner archives, for research purposes, just trying to find stuff out. And when this was around the time the band was still in the midst of their reunion in 2015, I sort of met with the band and said, hey, there's a lot of stuff here in the archives that you could do something with, reissue. There'd basically been Rhino had done a reissue campaign in 2008 of their individual albums with bonus tracks that Peter Jesperson had put together and done it beautifully. But there had been a kind of regime change at Rhino and they had moved away from doing that type of catalog stuff. And so, there was nothing happening on the replacement sort of archival or catalog front for 9 years really until we came along. And so I had proposed to the band that, hey, there's all this stuff that you could do. And eventually that, they agreed and Rhino kind of new regime came in there. There were replacements fans. They wanted to do stuff. And so 2017, we came out with the Live at Maxwell's For Sale record. And that was a huge, on catalog levels, a huge success, huge hit. And so that gave us the room to be more ambitious. And so the next project we did was something that Paul really wanted to do, which was a remix or to mix, let Matt Wallace, the producer of Don't Tell a Soul, mix that album. And that project became Dead Man's Pop with a remix and a live album and outtakes and all that sort of stuff. And we just kind of kept going from there. We've done a deluxe Pleased to Meet Me album with all the stuff from the studio that they were working on in demos. And then a Sorry Ma from their first album, which is probably in some ways my favorite because it's such a rare thing to have a baby band and an indie label band have so much material. There's like 100 songs on there, 80 of them are,
wow.
Or 75 of them are unreleased. And then, when we came around a couple of years ago, we took a year off and we said, well, what's the other sort of Rosetta Stone here? And that's a remix of Tim. And so, talked to the band about that and they agreed and the label agreed. And so we went about doing it. And really Ed Stasium was the only guy who we wanted for that and thought was appropriate because of his connection to Tommy Ramone and just because he has a great history of working with bands and his work sort of speaks for itself. And so we did that. And so, we're 4 box sets and a live album and various offshoots for Record Store Day and breakouts of those things. So it's been a pretty fertile time to be a Replacements fan, just in terms of releases and archival stuff. So we've managed, I'm pretty proud of that we've managed. So really for me, it was like, again, as a fan, I had this incredible opportunity and privilege to hear all this stuff and know about all this stuff. And I was just thinking, man, the rest of the world and the rest of the fans should be able to hear this stuff. So that was really kind of the drive behind, putting together this catalog campaign.
What's your position, if you have one, as you go through putting these reissues together in terms of, well, I was reading Ed Stasium writes a really great note in the liner notes for Let It Bleed about the process of doing the new mix. And I sort of stopped dead at one moment when he was mentioning a particular reverb plugin, which is a reverb plugin that I also use. And it was so cognitively dissonant for a second to be reading about Universal Audio Capital Chambers reverb and a Replacements record from the 80s. Do you, and I assume that the next one isn't going to be all shook down, but using AI to put Bob and Chris on it.
No.
Technology's offering more and more.
Well, it's funny, you say that, but the Replacements actually, Paul did a lot of his vocals for Don't Tell a Soul at Capitol Studios in '88. And he really liked going there because he's a big Frank Sinatra fan. He said, let's put a little Frank on it, And
yeah.
So it's sort of funny. But what Ed was trying to do and what we were trying to do is we basically kind of put together a big dossier for him on, what had happened with the record, what the band was unhappy about, the sort of technical things that they had expressed and, over time, and then talking to them more recently. And so he took all that in, and then he really went back and lived that record. I mean, he went through every scrap of tape, every recorded performance, and then had to be, so kind of a long story, but because of they assembled that record, the mix of that record on a kind of early computer system, which does not exist anymore. So Ed had to go back and really reassemble Tommy Ramone's mix first, and put that back together. And then he went in and sort of added stuff and changed stuff and kind of did his own version of it. So it was an incredibly laborious process for him just because of by dint of this weird technology they were using in '85 that didn't exist anymore. And so he really went through and lived that record again. And I can't say enough about the effort he took and how above and beyond he went. It wasn't just a job for him. And again, he felt a real personal connection. It was an opportunity for him in a weird way to work with Tommy Ramone, who obviously, again, who passed in 2014 and was one of his closest friends. And so, we were the real beneficiaries of Ed's, not just his years of experience, but the months of labor of really kind of going back and building the record from the ground up, which, a lot of guys in that position wouldn't have gotten as deep into it as he did. And so we were, like I said, very lucky to have somebody who was so committed to the cause as he was. And I think the results, sort of bear that commitment out.
You mentioned time earlier, and I think it's striking to me. Paul says in the book, we started 10 years too early or 10 years too late, or whatever. Right. And whether it's, they're putting the record together on this weird computer system that existed for 2 years and is now obsolete, or CDs got invented and they did a shitty master that then was all anyone heard for years, or there's no, I can think of now 50 alternative producers who would have worked perfectly with the Replacements, but that didn't really exist yet. And this was just a band that over and over found themselves at not quite the right moment.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. That was a big issue at the time. So that's a big, I spend a fair amount of time on the books or at the front end of every kind of album chapter talking about the process they went through to try and figure out a producer. And some of it was pretty funny and some of it was pretty crazy. And some of it was, and again, some of it was because they were hard to work with, they were only certain people would work with them. And, you needed a certain kind of personality. So, but as you say, at that time, certainly in the late '80s, there just wasn't the kind of, the idea of the alternative producer didn't even really exist. It was just coming out. The kind of the Mitch Easters and Don Dixons maybe existed, but the Scott Litts of the world were still just coming up. Mm-hmm. So it was a weird kind of time. I think that's why Paul sort of always thought that. And yet, they did find the right people. I think in his own way, Tommy Ramone was the right producer at that time for them. Jim Dickinson certainly, I think, probably got the most out of him. Matt Wallace, who was kind of unknown at the time, went on to do 6 great things with Faith No More and many other acts. He turned out to be the right guy, but usually the right guy for them wasn't about the guy who could get the hits or even make the best record, but kind of get the best out of them, because they were really the challenge. They were their own kind of biggest obstacle in a lot of ways. And so I think, that's unusually, I think, for a rock and roll band. I mean, sometimes I don't want to say the producer's negligible. Whoever you work with is important, but some bands are very self-determining and they're going to do whatever they do, whoever they're working with. The Replacements were kind of the least self-determining band. So they were very much subject to, reacting to, and impacted by their working situation and the people they were around, be it professionally with managers or A&R people or producers. And I think that's why, both in the book and in the liner notes, I spent a lot of time kind of talking about the people they worked with, because they were reactors. And so they were often, the records and the music sort of was a reaction to situations, people, et cetera. And so they're kind of, I think, particularly unique in that way.
And then at the end of the book, there's this beautiful scene. You're covering their reunion, which 2013 and 2014 was the extent of that, right?
Through 2015, actually. Through the middle of 2015, yeah.
And there's just this beautiful moment, moved me to tears, where they're on stage and suddenly the crowd is huge and singing the songs back. And you sort of mention all the guys that believed back in the day, sort of getting this belated but very real vindication that they were right. There was something really special about this band. And as a band guy and as someone who was at that point in the book so invested in the story of the Replacements, it was so beautiful. Like they were in the right time finally.
Yeah. No, I mean, that is kind of the story of that reunion. I think it was an incredible validation after, all the years of, and I think, with Bob passing in 95, I think it made it even more difficult for them to sort of assess or certainly appreciate what they'd done, because it was sort of now tinged with this terrible tragedy. And I think it took, again, like I say, it took the benefit of time, and then for them to do that reissue and just sort of to feel the love, tangibly, and to be playing, New York City, playing Flushing Meadows or whatever, playing in front of 14,000 people who were singing the songs back to them as these kind of generational anthems that they'd become in the intervening decades. And even though the band, Paul got disgruntled and short-circuited and that was it, I think they did get to do that victory lap. They did get to take that victory lap and at least know that for them and for the people that work with them, for the Michael Hills, for the Peter Jespersons, that they were right all along. They were their faith and their belief and their fandom wasn't misplaced. The circumstances might not have been right. The times might not have been right. Radio might not have been ready. The commercial world might not have been, but good songs, great bands sort of thankfully can kind of outlast the era and find their audience and find their true value and meaning. And I think the Replacements have, in great extent, certainly over the last, 5-10 years.
I mean, as someone who, as I mentioned earlier, wasn't there the first time around, their legacy was kept alive and they were kept there waiting for me to discover by a lot of music writers, and you very specifically in a big way. And so I feel like I have to, while I have you here, say, from me to you, I mean, this band is so meaningful to me. And the book has changed the way I think about music and think about art. Thank you for your part in doing that, because that's what makes the music live, man.
Yeah, well, no, I appreciate that. And, obviously that's a byproduct of wanting to tell the story, but, is also as a fan, I think that's a funny thing about being a Replacements fan. And again, maybe it's because they have an underdog quality. They always did, and they're scrappy and they're sort of real. And I think people who connect on that level, and the type of people who are really diehard Replacements fans, you're also kind of evangelists as well. You always want to get people into the Replacements and sort of share how great the band is. So I've been able to do that kind of writ large with the book and some of these projects, which is very gratifying. Because like I say, first and foremost, I'm a fan of the music and a fan of the band. And I just, kind of really admire them. It's funny, the book, because I think it's so unvarnished and truthful and painful and tragic in some ways, their story, I think some people came away, and because they could have, again, this was, they're in their 20s, guys in their 20s with alcohol problems and repression and all this stuff. They don't always come off as the best, but I think, so some people came away from the book not liking them as much, which is funny. I think, I kind of came away, and I think a lot of people also came away thinking, wow, it's amazing they achieved what they did given their circumstances, given their histories. It's amazing they made as much great music as they did. And in some ways you admire them more, knowing the true story. But, I've come to find that the Replacements are, they're like a Rorschach test. People see what they want to see in them and in their story. And it doesn't necessarily have to do with the reality of the Replacements, but it may be more about what that person's bringing, So, and I think that's also what makes them great, and interesting. And I think that is what has continued to keep them relevant, is they're a band that people can sort of take from what they want and project onto them what they want. And that keeps them alive and like I say, vibrant in a way that a lot of bands that are sort of fixed in time or fixed in the 80s or sort of frozen because of a hit or a moment that they were in the media spotlight, they don't have the benefit of that. So like I say, in some ways their story and their sort of quote unquote failure became a success, in the long run.
I couldn't agree more. Well, Bob, we like to end this show by asking what folks were eating, either in the studio or in the rehearsal space or whatever, while they worked. I think we know that while they were making Tim, the Replacements guys were mostly eating beer.
Less than on some records. They definitely were having beer and other things on other records. But yeah, I think by Replacement standards, Tim was a pretty tame session. So
I know you wrote this book over quite a long time, but I was curious if there was any meal or restaurant or food stuff that you associate with writing Trouble Boys.
Well, my wife, who is a musician as well, she was in a band called the Ets, and she has a solo deal with Mehr. She's a great singer and songwriter and rocker, but she's also a gourmet cook. So I think when I was in the real home stretch of writing the book, she was the one sort of keeping me fed and nourished with her various recipes, which are too many to mention one thing, but she's a great cook. So I was very lucky to have someone giving me a little TLC, because as anybody who's written a book knows, once you get into that final stage of things, not only is it, the hardest part because, you're having to let something go and trying to nail all the details. There's also just a fear that creeps in you because you're going to put it out into the world. So I was very lucky to have my wife sort of taking care of me and keeping me fed at the end there.
Well, shout out to your wife and shout out to you, Bob. And I guess shout out to the Replacements as a band and as individuals. And Tim the Record especially. It's fucking, what can you say? It's the Replacements, Tim, and it's Bob Mehr's Trouble Boys. And I can't thank you enough for chatting with me these many minutes. Really, really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you for taking the time, and I appreciate you having an interest in a 38, I guess now 39-year-old record and a 8-year-old book. So it's always appreciated.
I don't want to gush too much, but I was like, this is the fucking Bible.
Gush away.
This is it. This is it. We could put this thing on a satellite and explain rock and roll to space aliens. That's it. The narrative beats that we're all either hitting or we're too scared of to try and avoid. It's mythic, like I said.
Yeah, but the other part, you send this book into space, we're never going to make contact with the aliens. They're not going to want to come if they think everybody on Earth is like the Replacements in the 1980s, So
they're going to lean down here expecting a 30-pack of hams.
Right. Or Mars Attacks. They'll just start with the laser guns right away.
Man, that is a lot of talking about music. Honestly, I could have kept asking Bob questions for the entire day. It seems like he would just never run out of fascinating answers and fascinating new information to communicate to me. And I love nothing more than receiving that information. I love to think about music and read about it and talk about it. And sometimes in the dark of night, I do wonder if all that considering can maybe get between me and the music. But here's the thing. One of the things that interests me so much about major label debuts, one of the reasons I wanted to do this show, is that self-awareness does impact creation. That's just how it works. And as wild and impulsive as the Replacements come across, I think they were always aware that they were a rock band. Like, they knew intuitively what it meant to live that story, to embody that legend, it seems to me at least. So I think if there was ever a band that could stand up to a whole lot of yakking about it, it's probably them. And yet, put on Bastards of Young, and the second that guitar hits, right away, all of the thinking and considering just gets obliterated anyway. Your brain gets out of the way, your heart takes over. That's rock and roll, baby. So thanks to Bob Mehr for the amazing book and the great talk. Thanks to Paul and Tommy and Bob and Chris for the great songs, the great records, and thank you for listening. Major Label Debut is produced by Josh Hook and John Paul Bullock. Our theme music is by Greg Alsop. We have shirts and mugs for sale on our website, majorlabeldebut.com. Please subscribe and review and rate and like and share and press the buttons to make the podcast go successful mode. And of course, if you have any favored major label debuts that you would like to hear us talk about, let us know in the comments or, the places where the letting us know happens. You all know how computers work. That's all for this time, but we'll be back soon with more tales from the intersection of art and commerce.